Hello everyone. Recently we've reached 30 subs and I wanted to thank you guys so much for supporting my channel. And I've recently created a subreddit which I will link in the description if you want to submit your story as well. I'd also like to give a shout out to Dr. Creepens. His channel will be linked in the description below and hopefully we'll be doing a collab together soon. Stay creepy. Anyways, with that said, let's jump in. Three years ago, me and my girlfriend at the time moved in with her mother. We didn't have a lot of money saved up. We both worked at Walmart. Her on nights with her mother, and myself on days. We brought our 25-pound cat named Kiki with us. Kiki was a very reserved cat. She never got really excited, or even moved much for that matter. She had a very special place that she would love to lay. This place was on the end of our couch. When me and my ex moved in, we ended up taking the basement. I honestly didn't care about what room we got. Me and her were both broke at the time, so a place to stay was perfect enough. This basement was a very old basement. The wallpaper and flooring looked like I just stepped into the 70s. This basement has 3 rooms. They weren't connected to any doors though. It was connected through archways. We had our setup a little different. Our couch was staged so the stairs leading down were directly behind the couch. Because there wasn't a stable place to place our TV at fear of someone walking down the stairs and knocking it off the stand. So we had the TV on the wall on the other side of the room. One night, I had the day off the next day, so I decided to stay up late and game. My girlfriend and her mother were at work. I happened to buy Dead Space, and it was a game I've been wanting to play for the longest time. Thinking back, it probably wasn't the best idea playing alone in a house that dates back to the 20s. My cat was lying right next to me while I was busy gaming. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I had the most unexplainable thing happen to me. I was at a point in Dead Space where you upgrade your weapons and armor. I remember the game being almost soundless when I heard the first step. I thought maybe it was one of the monsters in the video game, so I didn't think much of it. Well, that was until I heard a flutter of steps right behind me coming down the stairs. It was very quick, almost childlike. I didn't have time to look behind me until I felt it. I felt a breeze of air hitting the back of my neck, like when someone runs by you. At this point, I heard a sound of someone jumping on my bed in the next room, like when a child was playing on a bed. Every single hair on my neck and arms stood up. I was lost in thought. Did I just really hear that? Before my cat snapped me out of it. At the time, my 25-pound cat bolted from the couch and ran under the archway into the other room, and she let out a growl. I didn't think she could ever muster up that. Her tail and fur were standing higher than my goosebumps. I finally got up and managed to flicker on the light to the other room. I thought to myself, this has to be a prank. Before I ran out to my bed in the other room, I bolted with as much courage as I could to my bed. Whatever this was, I was going to make sure that he or she knew not to break in or screw with me again. Before I jumped on my bed to confront whoever this person was, something made me stop in my tracks at the foot of my bed. At the very end, you could see an outline of someone sitting cross-legged on the edge. But there wasn't a person there. It was like there was a permanent indent on our mattress. I backed up a little until I backed up so much I hit my wall. Once I had my back against it, I just watched the outline slowly raise back up, like the person just got up and walked away. I stood there for what seemed like an eternity. I stood there until I heard footsteps walking back up the stairs. My cat ran after whatever it was. I heard her on the next story, running as fast as she could across the flooring. I don't remember much more than me debating on if this happened or not. I still debate to this day. It didn't seem real, or like I was in my right state of mind. My cat to this day will not lay on our couch in the basement. Whoever you are, let's not meet again. I had just moved out of a share house in the suburbs and into my own shitty one-bedroom apartment in the city. I'm a male and at the time was around 25 years old. My apartment, while old and small, was located about 500 meters from one of the most popular night spots in the inner city. As I was in my mid-20s and out on my own, this was the perfect place for me. This was because my friends and I were quite social and would frequent bars and nightclubs in the city, and taxi fares were starting to add up. Also, this new apartment was close to my work, so it made sense. I got settled in right away and invited my friends over for pre-drinks before hitting the clubs. Due to the limited space in the apartment, this meant that some friends were inside and some were drinking out in the walkway just out front. We had the music up and had just started drinking between songs. I could hear the couple next door arguing. Now the apartment was old and shitty, which meant thin walls too. So I pressed my ear to the wall in order to listen in. I hadn't met any of my new neighbors at this time, as I didn't take long to move in and I didn't really see anyone during it. I was curious. Judging from what I could determine while eavesdropping, they were a gay couple in their early 30s. One of the men was yelling at each other to go next door and tell us to keep it down. The other was arguing that it was just a housewarming and let it go for the night. Since I didn't want to cause trouble, I marshaled everyone outside to start making our way to the nightclubs, leaving my new neighbors in peace. Later that night, I came home as I was tired from the move. I decided to let my friends carry on partying without me. I arrived at my door and proceeded to fumble around for my keys when I looked up to see a man standing in the walkway in front of my next apartment smoking a cigarette. He was a tall and thin man with brown, oily hair. I noticed that he also had a cut lip and a faded but still visible black eye. I said, "Good day, sorry about the noise earlier," correctly assuming he was my neighbor. He replied, "Nah, you're alright, mate. I'm Chris," and he shook my hand. I noticed his knuckles were red and a little bit scratched up, so I knew something was off. I apologized for the noise and said, "I hope I didn't cause any trouble for you." He withdrew his hand and with a soft but crackling in his voice, he said, "Nah, that's alright. Rick just gets a bit cranky sometimes. I'm used to it." With that, I finished off the conversation and told Chris that I'd see him later. It was about 2 a.m. at this point, and I just wanted to go to sleep, but couldn't help worrying about the potential domestic abuse going on next door. I decided to keep an eye out for it now, as I didn't have all the info. For all I knew, he could have gotten into a fight with someone else. As the weeks passed, I noticed that my new neighbor got drunk regularly and would argue almost every time. I could tell that Rick was the dominant one, as his voice was a lot deeper, and Chris seemed to be afraid of him during their shouting matches. This is why I kept my distance and never really socialized with them. I would even overhear them arguing about me and that Rick thought Chris liked me, etc. I would just tune all of this out with headphones and video games, not to mention an active social life and full-time work to keep me occupied. I did find myself avoiding having guests over because of the neighbors. I would opt to meet people out, as their arguments would be quite upsetting. This was working out fine enough for a while until Christmas Eve that same year. I was arriving home after coming from last-minute Christmas shopping. I was getting ready for a night of present wrapping, as I was to visit my family the following day for Christmas. As I arrived home, I noticed 2 police cars outside, and Anna, an Asian woman who lived a few apartments up from Chris, was screaming. I asked her what was happening, and all she said was, "It's just so sad," while sobbing. I could see 3 officers trying to restrain somebody, and there was blood on their uniforms. I came just a little bit closer to see Chris's oily brown hair in the center of the affray. His face was bleeding from his jaw, while he had apparently been slashed by something sharp. They got him to his feet, and I could see that his cheek had been cut so deep that the skin was flapping open as he struggled and resisted with the police. I recoiled in shock and went to comfort Anna, who was crying uncontrollably at this point. Suddenly, Rick's voice boomed out from nowhere. "You see what you've done? You fucking loser, just kill yourself." This frightened me, and my instinct was to get myself and Anna to safety. Even though the cops were here, they had their hands full with Chris, and I certainly didn't want to get involved in such an ugly fight where knives were involved. Anna refused to come with me and said that she would be fine. I looked around to see where Rick was, as he kept yelling at Chris the whole time. The 3 cops struggled to restrain him. I could hear Chris whimpering apologetically in between. I couldn't see where Rick was, so I decided to just go to my apartment and lock the door. As I turned to go, I froze in horror as Rick's voice boomed.
Where the fuck are you going?
A deep chill went down my spine as my brain struggled to reconcile the fact that these words were coming out of Chris's mouth. I felt panic grip me as I realized that, at this time, Rick and Chris were the same person. All the fighting, laughing, drinking, and carry on that I couldn't help overhearing over the last couple of months had come from one solitary person. A lonely guy in his small 1-bedroom apartment. For some reason, this made me feel sick. I learned later from Anna that this wasn't the first time the police had to come out and take Chris away. Anna explained that he spends a couple of months at the local psychiatric hospital each time. His father owns the apartment, so it's here waiting for him when he gets out. I moved out a few months later, and while it is a sad situation for Chris, and I really do feel for him, let's not meet again. Okay, so my friend and I are 24, and we both have young 7-month-old boys. We started off swimming in the big pool, paddling around the middle shallows with our baby boys in their floaties. They were loving the newfound ability to splash around while floating, while enjoying the water and sun. All of a sudden, this bald guy that looks like he's in his 60s slinks over on from the deep end of the pool and just starts hanging around us. He had been hanging around a bunch of young kids that were playing, jumping in the deep end prior to seeing us, but as far as I could see, he didn't seem to have any relations to any of them. Anyway, it started by him slowly coming closer, moving a few meters at a time, while stopping to lean against the edge of the pool every 30 seconds or so. Then, he crossed the gap between the 2 walls that separated the shallow, kiddie area, ramp entry, and the big pool, and came and stood right next to my friend and I as we were letting our boys play. By this point, my creeper radar is going off like crazy, and I whispered to my friend,
Oh my god, what the hell? This is so fucking creepy.
She responded saying that she felt the same. He started trying to interact with our sons while they were splashing, and we tried to move away from him. While not encouraging his actions by responding, he just looked as though he wasn't going to leave us alone if we started talking back to him. We moved well away from him to the other shallow end to try and shake him off, but he fucking followed us all the way to the steps, hovering around the wall, trying to stay close to us. Not swimming, just standing and bobbing around in the shallows, looking around the pool and trying to interact with our boys. And with us, we happened to get within 2 meters of him while playing with our sons. We then decided to leave the big pool and go to the toddler's pool because it's a separate fenced off area. This guy was just being way too creepy for our liking. We were uncomfortable, and he was not getting the hint that we didn't want anything to do with him. As we were leaving, he again tried to interact with our sons as we had to walk past him to exit the pool. We once again ignored him and walked out to move all of our things to the fenced area. He then proceeded to watch us in the baby paddle pool from the big pool, watching and turning away when we would look at him. And when he decided he was done with swimming, he came and sat right against the fence next to the toddler pool. He started looking over at us every 5 minutes and turning away whenever we looked at him. I started taking photos at this point, just in case. My mom's senses were screaming stranger danger, and I wanted to have something that I could use if needed in the future. Anyways, he sat down next to some other guy, right next to the fence of the toddler pool. They sat there talking about God knows what, but he kept looking over at us. I only knew because I was facing straight at him, but every time my friend turned around, he would snap his head as if he weren't looking at us. Him and his buddy finally left after a while. They left together, and the bald guy was looking at us the entire time. Another woman that was at the pool with us said that he'd been watching her 10-year-old daughter as she played with the younger kids in the big pool, and that he was giving her the same creeper vibes. Old creepy dude at the pool, I don't know if you had bad intentions or if you were just too ignorant to realize you were being a creeper, but let's not meet ever again and stay the fuck away from our kids. My husband and I were at the supermarket, and our baby was especially being fussy. So he took her for a quick drive, and the motion of which usually calms her down. It only took about 10 minutes to settle her, and I was still in the store, but was unsure how much longer I'd be, and there's poor cell reception inside. So he pulled back into the parking lot to wait for me. It was an unseasonably nice day, so he took her in her car seat to sit on one of the benches outside the store. He took a business call and had just sat them down. Absentmindedly rocking the carrier when a woman, well-dressed, mid-30s, average height, and fit build approached them. It's not uncommon for people to ask to play with our baby. She has big rosy cheeks, soft wisps of gold hair, and the most adorable, gurgly, toothless grin, especially when she's deep into a good nap. But her nap schedule is paramount, so my husband was preparing to tell the woman she actually couldn't play with our baby right then. She walked over right in their direction, brimming with nonchalant confidence, and before he can even finish his sentence explaining she was napping and not to be touched, she picked up the carrier and started walking off. He was in shock for a minute, not fully believing someone would be ballsy enough to do something so sinister in plain daylight. So he said, "Excuse me, put her down." As his panic mounted, she remained calm this entire time, but when he called after her, she started walking away more briskly than when she'd approached. He ran full speed ahead, trying to grapple the carrier out of her hands, finally resulting to restraining her arms. This woman yells, "Help! He's trying to take my baby! Kidnapping! 911! Help!" kicking him in the shin and pulling a pink bottle of pepper spray out of her handbag. Of course, no one in the parking lot was clocking the earlier interaction, and assumed he really was a kidnapper. A lone man in a Deadpool t-shirt versus a tiny, well-dressed woman. Immediately, a man knocked my husband to the ground and was holding him down. He could hear bystanders encouraging the woman to file a police report, but she was doing a very convincing job of acting shaken up and insisted she just wanted to get home. To make matters worse for my husband, she was driving a minivan. He was in a raw state of panic, realizing the entire parking lot had banded together to inadvertently facilitate the kidnapping of our daughter. He was begging and pleading with them, but no one was listening. They just kept screaming at him that the jig was up and he needed to lie still and wait for police and stop terrorizing a young mother. My husband finally had the novel idea to show them the family pictures on his phone, but too panicked to think clearly, this manifested him as shouting out, "I have pictures of the baby in my phone," which, of course, everyone interpreted as him having either stalking photos or worse, pornographic images of the baby. At this point, that man, I can't entirely blame the man considering what he thought was going on, kicked my husband as hard as he could in the ribs. It was at this point I was coming out of the store and I thought he was being robbed by these people. I was yelling for security, so I panicked. My chest constricted and I could barely get any sound out. It was only then I realized he did not have our baby with him. When I saw she was being held by a woman, I was relieved. I thought maybe the woman had intervened to move my daughter out of harm's way, while my husband was being robbed and was walking away to get help. I couldn't find a security guard outside the store, so I ran up to the people holding my husband down, waving my wallet, pleading, "Take everything you want, just let up and leave us alone." And one of the men holding him down said something like, "Lady, we need to wait for the police to deal with him," and I was so confused. Why would the muggers have called the police? I just kept stammering. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" And then made out someone saying, "He tried to abduct that woman's kid." I did not understand and was sure I misheard him. My husband would never hurt a child, and we have 4 kids. If he were going to commit a crime, bringing home another child that day would have been the bottom of his list. I kept trying to understand what the man was saying, and suddenly it all clicked. I looked around for the woman who had the baby carrier, and she was halfway across the parking lot. I went into total ballistic tiger cub mode. literally leapt out of my heels and sprinted across the parking lot. I'm not a UFC fighter. I've never even taken a self-defense class, so all I could think to do was grab the woman by her hair and squeeze her throat with my other hand, which didn't do much. She was getting away, even as I grappled with her. Amazingly, none of the other bystanders had yet to connect that my husband was telling the truth and that this woman was abducting my baby. I yanked on her hair as hard as I could, and that was enough to make her drop the carrier. I was so scared and surprised that I actually just threw myself on top of the carrier, covering the entire thing like a blanket, and stayed that way without saying or doing anything else. The woman left. Not one person tried to stop her, even though she was clearly leaving without the child she claimed was hers, which would be pretty damn incriminating if I'd watched this scene unfold. Within the next couple minutes, police had arrived. After that, there were still several bystanders who explained it was my husband trying to kidnap the baby. The police, to my horror, assumed that she must have not had bad intentions. The first questions they asked me, after getting her description, wasn't investigative. They were questions thinly veiled, trying to convince me not to pursue charges, still placing blame on my husband. A small sampling. Do your husband and the baby look dissimilar? Is there a chance she thought he was abducting the baby and she was trying to intervene? Could your husband have been doing something inappropriate or violent to the baby that would have made her feel compelled to extract the baby from the situation? Could your husband have been doing something inappropriate or violent to the baby that would make her feel compelled to extract the baby from the situation? Did she seem groggy or confused? Could she have mistaken either of them for her own family members? They spent more time verifying that the baby was actually mine than they concerned themselves with the fact that the baby was not actually hers. My husband had called his brother at this point, who works in an office with a lot of lawyers, and connected with one ASAP, who gave us the priceless advice to get every officer's name and badge number, to request copies of the store's security tapes right away, and to escalate our complaint higher up on the chain if these officers weren't taking us seriously. Finally, we had reason enough to believe we were being taken seriously, and we went home, and both just shook and cried until we had to get our other kids from school. My husband is seething with rage and grappling with a feeling of helplessness from how little he was able to do, and has 2 cracked ribs from when the man kicked him. To the officer's credit, they did ask if he'd like to press charges, but considering the man was genuinely convinced at the time that he was on the right side of intervening in a kidnapping and stayed to talk to the police and apologize profusely when the truth became clear, he declined to press charges. Amazingly and frustratingly, there were still people who stuck around to talk to the police, who were giving my husband dirty looks, and one man who even implored the police to involve CPS to verify it was really our baby. Parking lot kidnapper and the parking lot skeptics. You better hope we don't meet. When I was about 7 or 8, I was living with my family in their small apartment in a large city. The complex was pretty dense, lots of neighbors, lots of strangers. There was always a lot of traffic coming through, even through the night. So hearing someone walk up and down the stairs at 3 a.m. is pretty normal. I remember that my brother, around 5 years older than I, had only just begun staying with us for a short time, and that we had presumably his Wii set up in the living room. Though it could have been mine. I can't quite remember when I got my own. The Wii was a newer system at this time, and I was a game junkie, so I was excited as hell to play the system, especially with games like Guitar Hero already set up and ready for me. For the couple of weeks in the summer he was there, I was constantly playing the Wii in the latest hours of the night, usually staying up until 3 or 4 a.m., rocking out or bowling or Mario. You know the drill. I was already staying up pretty late before we got the Wii, but this was my excuse to keep doing it. My brother would often fall asleep on the couch behind me while I was playing around 1 a.m., and I'd play a little quieter until I was finished. Although I was young and carefree at the time, I've always had a sort of knack for remaining situationally aware, and since I was especially good at eavesdropping, it was almost second nature for me to constantly be listening for anything and anyone, and pretending like I couldn't hear anything going on around me. Of course, I didn't realize I was doing this at the time, but I've had several years of growth and introspection since that time and have come to learn the patterns of my behavior that remain even today. At first, everything was dandy. Business as usual, lots of gaming and lots of progress. After a day or two, I would notice people going up and down our stairs a lot more often. There was just a ton of rumbling outside at all hours of the night, after midnight. I even heard a bit of talking, though I couldn't understand it. Whether it was muffled or they were speaking Spanish, I'm still not sure to this day. A week or so after my brother was home, I have a distinct memory of hearing a sound and seeing an immediate flash of light outside. But when I turned my head to look at the window, covered by long vertical blinds except for one that had come off at the end, so the only view was a small sliver of our porch or balcony. All I saw was darkness. I turned back to my game and pretended to continue playing, hoping that nobody was outside, but also hoping that if there was anyone there, they didn't notice me turn my head. I heard several distinctly mechanical noises throughout the rest of the night that I'm fairly certain were the sounds of a shutter of a camera, but no more flashes. After about 3 a.m., I decided I was probably hearing things from our neighbor's house and ignored it, packed it up, and went to sleep. This continued for about another week, the sounds of the camera and people walking back and forth throughout the night. That is, I didn't think it was really anything to worry about. I had basically assumed at this point that it was all next door, and that it didn't matter much. I never mentioned it to my brother while he was there, nor my parents. I just continued my nightly ritual of playing the crap out of whatever game I could. After a week of hearing these noises outside, I had become curious about what was going on. I played that night until my brother went to sleep, and carefully positioned myself in a way that I could hear quite well outside, but it looked like I was entranced in my game, in case anybody was watching me, of course. I wasn't sure that was even the case, but I knew it was at least a possibility, and wanted to appear oblivious if so. I had heard the characteristic rumbling of people going up and down the stairs, and I remember it quieting a bit around 1:30 a.m. However, I didn't hear the mechanical sounds, and I didn't see any flashes, so I decided I was going to go outside and check it out. To paint the picture, our apartment complex was set up so there were 8 units to each building, 4 in the front, 4 in the back. There are 2 units on the ground floor and 2 units on the second floor on each side of the building. Our apartment was on the top floor at the far end of one of these units, so you had to walk up the stairs and through an uncovered walkway to our balcony. There's a small porch right by the front door for seating, and we had somewhat filled with various things. I remember specifically that there was a large printer or fax machine of sorts right on the ground in front of the window, basically centered below where the last blind gave way to the inside of the home, and a chair beside the printer, facing towards the open area between the porch and the walkway. So I quietly and slowly moved below the window, view from my window blocked by the couch that was up against the wall, and crawled to the front door, slowly as ever, heart pounding from both anxiety and excitement. I unlocked the door and tiptoed onto the balcony. There was nobody on our porch, and I didn't hear anybody walking outside next door. I peeked through the railing besides the walkway, and my breath caught as I noticed several, maybe 5, dark figures standing in front of the entire unit, near a tree in between all the units around. I couldn't tell who they were, but they all sounded male. It didn't appear that any of them saw me, so I continued to watch in silence for a time. Normally, it wouldn't trip me out much, but there was something just generally weird about the way they were talking that felt suspicious. They looked weary, and the way they spoke sounded like they were angry, but I couldn't understand them. I thought they might have been where all the camera sounds were coming from, but I didn't see any cameras, though it was dark and those faced away from me could have easily been carrying one. They didn't look like anybody I have seen in the complex before. I watched and listened for a long time, probably a half an hour, trying to see if they were the ones going up and down the stairs. However, they didn't appear to be leaving, or doing much of anything. I took that as a confirmation that my suspicions were in vain, and that they were up to adult stuff I didn't need to worry about. I turned around and went back into the apartment, and decided I didn't need to stress about it anymore. The next night, I think my parents were upset that I'd been playing video games all night for the last few nights, because at about midnight, I feigned sleep on the couch adjacent to one my brother had been sleeping on. A while later, I heard my parents check the living room, and stalk back to their bedroom. I quietly stood up and turned the Wii on. My dad had started the shower, and my mom was watching videos on the computer, so they didn't hear me playing. I did also keep the volume quite low. I was able to get some serious gaming done for a few minutes. At around 1 a.m., I started to hear the rumbling of the stairs, although I had decided that what was going on was unrelated to me. I remember still feeling on edge about it. Then, a few minutes after hearing people coming up and down the stairs, I began to hear a very distinct sound, the sound of some big object squeaking. I didn't understand what the noise was at the time, but it basically sounded like hardened plastic being bent and groaning from pressure. It also sounded extraordinarily close. I was sat on the floor in front of the couch my brother was sleeping on, so the window and front door were to my right, and I had a pretty clear view to the porch through the area that the blind was missing. It was dark outside, so I couldn't see anything, but once I heard the sound, I had major goosebumps and felt off. So I kept glancing at the sliver of the window I could see. At this point, I was scared. I didn't understand what the sound was. I kept hearing people moving outside, and I didn't understand why. I assumed they were right in front of our apartment, and couldn't figure out what to do. The sound of pressure on plastic continued for about 2 minutes or so before it quieted down. At that point, I would hear the creaking of hard plastic every 30 seconds or so, maybe a little bit more frequent. I had the game on and kept moving my arms as though I was playing, but I wasn't paying attention to the game in the slightest. I don't even remember which one was on. Out of nowhere, everything went silent. I could hear no creaking, no shuffling of feet, no rumbling of the stairs, no voices, nothing at all. This put me over the edge, and for some reason, I knew there was something seriously wrong. I was terrified. I thought they might be getting ready to break into our house and rob us, or something of the sort. I didn't really know what to think, or what to do. A final roaring screech of plastic bending filled the air. I immediately turned my head all the way to the right, not caring whether they knew I could see them or not. I stared for a moment at the blackness, and a couple of $100 bills shone through it, illuminated by the light inside our house. It took a minute for me to comprehend what I was seeing. At first, all I saw was the money, slowly being moved back and forth in front of the window. I was in shock at having my suspicions that there was someone outside confirmed. And it took a minute before I saw gloves holding the money, and arms extending into the darkness beyond. After a moment of utter confusion, I finally realized what was going on. There was somebody kneeling on top of our printer, shoving money at the window, trying to entice me to come outside. At this point, my fight-or-flight response kicked in, and being a scrawny 7 or 8-year-old girl left no option but the latter. I screamed as loud as I possibly could and bolted out of the living room towards my parents' room. I remember the sound of the shower shutting off, my mom screaming, "What happened?" or something of the sort, and my dad eventually following through with the same. Only about 30 seconds had passed, and I was filled with tears. All I could do was cry, eventually mumbling something about there being someone outside. My dad, my amazingly protective dad, immediately grabbed his gun and went outside. It's about 1:30 a.m. at this point, and my mom held me while I cried in the living room, and we waited patiently for my dad to find out who was out there. My dad came back a few minutes later and stated that he didn't see anyone out there, but that he was going to stay outside with his gun and waited for a bit. I was tired as hell from the anxiety and finally having this all come to a head, but I could not find sleep. The only thing I could do was listen to my heart beating and wait. My poor dad sat on a chair on our porch all night, quietly waiting with his gun for anyone to show. My mom consoled me the entire time, and told me that if this ever happens again, to walk calmly to their room so that my screaming doesn't scare them away. I didn't tell her about the fact that I had been hearing these people outside for the past few weeks, and I never mentioned that I thought they had a camera or that they may have taken photos of me. I don't know why. I was just so shaken up, and by the time I even thought about the noises I heard, it had been long enough that I didn't want to talk about it. They didn't contact the police, and my dad stayed out there until the sun finally surfaced around 6 a.m. My dad never saw a soul in a complex that was nearly always busy. Only then, I could finally find sleep, and needless to say, the blinds were covered from that point on. I stopped staying up at night, especially alone, and we moved away from the complex shortly thereafter. I actually developed a fear of open or unobstructed windows, and especially refused to be near any window at night. It still affects me to this day, though not nearly as bad, unbeknownst to anyone I associate with, even my fiance. I didn't really understand why my parents didn't call the cops, but later on, I found out my parents used drugs, and I assumed from then on that it was just to make sure that there weren't any issues with CPS or getting caught. However, I had a talk with my parents about it several years later, and they assumed that I had a bad dream after they saw that I was asleep in the living room and that there was never anybody there. It hurt when they told me that, and due to their apprehension to believe me, I never told another person. All I have is my own memory, and only I know what truly happened in those weeks. Recently, I've had a bit of a rough time with old childhood memories that I suppressed being brought to the forefront of my mind. And though I don't have the time or energy to tell them all, I may perhaps come to terms with them eventually, and I'll continue to tell my story on my own time. For all I know, if my dad wasn't there that night, I'd be kidnapped, and God knows else what. So, Mr. Creepy Kidnapper Guy, let's not meet again.